So welcome to MuleSoft 101, building APIs and integration with Anypoint Platform. Before we get started, who here has used an API? With a show of hands. Who here has built an API? Nice. So the people who did not raise their hands about using an API, they just don't know it yet. Because you use APIs every day in all the things that we use, technology or not. But before we get started, forward-looking statement, please make sure that you make your purchasing decisions based on what's generally available and not what future-looking products that we show here. So to do this demo, essentially what we are going to do is we are going to go on a journey with a fictional retail outdoor manufacturer called Northern Trail Outfitters. So they've started using MuleSoft, and we are going to see what it looks like for their journey for using Anypoint Platform, from going from one API to building a complete application network. So to get started, let's look at a journey of an NTO customer. This is Lauren. She's an avid outdoor runner and also an NTO customer. She wants to run a half marathon this year, so she starts by searching on Google about what does she need to do to prepare. And she finds some articles, and at some point, she sees an ad for NTO on her article. She clicks on this article, and she goes to the website where she finds a jacket that she likes. She adds it to her cart, and just about when she's about to check out, she gets distracted. But don't worry, we also sent her an email asking her, hey, can you check out your cart? Is there anything missing? Not only that, since NTO systems are integrated with each other, we can also show up an ad on Facebook saying, hey, download the mobile app, and maybe we'll give you a 30% discount. So she likes that idea. She decides to use the promo code and gets the jacket through the mobile app. But right when she gets it and orders it, she realizes that it's not going to arrive on time by the time of the marathon. So she calls customer support. And the customer support rep that she's speaking to has complete visibility into her purchase history, her profile, what she likes, and he's able to provide expedited shipping at no cost. So that's a great experience. Everyone here expects these kinds of experiences from retailers, insurance companies, anything you deal with on the consumer mindset. So why aren't everyone doing it? Why is this, if this is so obvious, why isn't every company having this experience where you can order online, you can track your consumers, you can show these ads, show promo codes? So why isn't everyone doing it? Because it's not easy. As we see, competitors are more and more innovative, and there is more competition within your field as the companies grow. And essentially, you need to be fast. You need to be agile. You need to adapt to new technologies very quickly as they arrive. Secondly, data breaches are very common. So you need to make sure the customer data that you capture from your customers, you need to retain it in a secure way so that you build that trust model with your customer. Next, you should be ready for peak loads. So seasons like Thanksgiving, seasons like Christmas, you need to be sure that your APIs, integration, web portals, they're all up and running during these time frames, and they can scale as demand increases. And lastly, new channels are being added constantly, which means IoT devices being added, kiosk experiences being added, things on the airplane where you can select and shop online, those are being added. So you need to adapt to these changes, for which you need to have a future-proof architecture. So NTO decides to use MuleSoft, and what MuleSoft provides them is with accelerated delivery so that they can build projects faster, which reduces the time for them to launch new channels. They start with a secure foundation, so they have a platform that suffices their complex security needs and the compliance that they need to meet out. And then lastly, operations. So they also need to make sure that operations are resilient and they can grow as the channels from them grow. And with using Anypoint Platform, what NTO will be able to do, and what we will see in this demo, is we will deliver these new experiences quickly. We'll make sure the APIs and the integrations that we build are safe and secure to the utmost standards. We'll make sure that the APIs that we build are able to scale as the demand from our customers and from our internal folks grow. And then lastly, we will be prepared for new channels as they arrive. So to get started, we are going to look at the first benefit, which is how do we accelerate delivery, or how do we make projects faster. So there is meet Marty, who is a system administrator for NTO. He owns a customer database, and he has access to this database where the customer data is stored, but it's very hard to get access to this database for the other developers at NTO. So essentially, every time somebody needs access, they come to Marty. They're like, Marty, can you give me access? And Marty has to go through that flow. So he decides to take over a project where he's going to unlock data from this MySQL database. And to do so, he's going to build a REST API on top of this MySQL database, which means there will be an interface to talk to this database, which is familiar to the developers that are going to use that. So let's see how Marty does that. And for folks who haven't ever built an API or might be just starting off, so the way we will build this API is we are going to write a design first. So like an architect, before building a building, they draw it out and they make sure the design is perfect. Similarly, we are going to design this API first about how it's going to look like, and then we are going to do the implementation parts of it. So let's jump right into the demo. So I'm going to make it full screen. OK, so Marty, firstly, what he does is logs into Anypoint Platform. This is the homepage where he can see design tools, where he can design his APIs and integrations. He can see Exchange, which is a marketplace for internal and external assets, and Management Center, which is his single pane of glass to manage APIs and integration at one place. So first, he logs into Design Center and creates a new API specification. So he's going to say, create a new API specification, and let's call it NTO Customer API. And we're going to use the Visual API Designer for this project. As Marty, so designing an API, you need to model it in modeling languages like RAML and OAS. And Marty is not familiar with these modeling languages. So he's going to just use the Visual GUI editor. Here, we can give our API a name. So we'll call this a customer API. And first thing we'll do is we'll create a data type. This data type is going to represent what a customer looks like for NTO. So instead of adding all the fields one by one, I have an example that I have used from the past. An example is just a JSON object where it has like the customer name, John Smith, whose age is 25. So it's just an example that he added. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a resource. Let's call it the customer's resource. And we'll add a get method to this resource. Whenever somebody says get customers, we are going to respond with a status 200, which means OK. And then we are going to respond with the customer object that we just created. Similarly, let's add a post method. In this time, we are going to respond with 201, which means created. And when somebody creates a customer, we are going to respond with saying order created or customer created. We can also add one more resource, and let's call it customers by ID. And this is to get an individual customer. So if you were to get customer number 1, then you would say /customer/1. And again, we'll respond with a body of the type customer. So while we are doing this, you must have noticed in the sidebar, it was being modeled in RAML and OAS simultaneously. So I don't need to learn these modeling languages, but if I do know these, I have the flexibility to work on either of these languages. And not only that, I can turn on this thing called the mocking service, which will add a base URI to our specification, which means that there is a link that is automatically created for this API. And if I go to try it, and let's say I wanted to try the get customer by ID, you can see it automatically created this box for us to enter the ID. And if I get customer by ID 121, here's the kind of response I will get. So I can try it before even publishing it or starting to work on implementing it. So this is just like a model of the API. And at this point, I want to get feedback from my developers. Like, are you able to use this API? Because I want to build this so that I don't have to give you access to my MySQL database. So let's publish this API to Exchange to share it with other people's. And once it's published, let's open up Exchange. And you can see the resources that we just created are automatically documented within Exchange. So the get method and the post method are there on the customer's resource, and then you have the get customers by ID. If you click on it, you get code samples. So if I wanted to make a curl request, if I wanted to write a JavaScript app which was going to get customers or show customer information, then I can get these code samples right from here. So I could copy this into my application and just start using this as if it was a real API. And the same way we tested earlier, we can test it here as well. And the benefit of this is essentially we have just built a specification that developers can take this link and embed it into their own applications. And even though this data is not coming from the actual MySQL database, this is good for them to start building while Marty figures out how to get the information from the database. So at this point, Marty can share this API. The application developers can share this API with all the application developers that are going to use it. And they can provide feedback and write reviews for this API saying, hey, Marty, we need this feature, or hey, we need like a delete orders feature. And they can add those features as they go forward. So what we just did is we created an API design. But again, we need to add business logic that actually pulls data from MySQL. So how do you do that? So next thing Marty needs to do is he needs to implement this API. So he navigates to Anypoint Studio. Anypoint Studio is an IDE, which is like an interactive developer console where you can create a new project, new Mule project. Let's call it NTO Customer API, Customers API. And Studio is already integrated with Exchange. So essentially, when you add a dependency, we can find the same API that we just published on Exchange, the customer API that we were just looking at. We can add it to our project. And when we hit finish, it reads the specification we created, and it figures out what are the different methods that are required to publish this API. So it automatically created a flow where it has the get customers and the post customers methods. Now, all I need to do to add business logic is drag and drop different components from the Mule palette to build this API. So for us, it would be the database connector. So we would find the database connector. It looks like there is a lot of operations available. So we are going to select the select operation from the database, and we are going to drag and drop it to our get flow. And it's showing us an error. And the error is due to the configuration. So it's asking us, hey, add your credentials to get access to the database. And to save some time, I've already done that on another project. So I'm just going to open that up. And we are going to go to the same database connector. And I'm going to show you what I did. So essentially, I just added all my credentials here. And I can also test my connection. So you can just, it actually goes to the database and make sure the connection is possible. And going back to our flow, so here we already made the connection to the database. In the query, you can see we are writing select star from customers where ID equals whatever is passed in the URL. But now we also need to transform the data. So the way data is stored in database is not the same way people consume the data. So we just saw we wanted that customers JSON object that we were just looking at. So we need to transform this data. So what a DataSense does, it automatically gets into the database, and it figures out that these are the fields available in the get customer table, so the customer table. And on the right-hand side is what the API is expecting. So the API, we defined it in a certain format, so we need to make sure that the database returns the data in a format that we defined in the specification. So to convert this format now, all you need to do is just drag and drop these components from the left-hand side to right-hand side, and it automatically writes the data weave code that is required to do this transformation. And you can simply run this project right after making these kinds of changes. And while it runs, I just wanted to highlight that you can drag and drop and create these data transformations. And then if there is advanced use cases where someone at the booth was asking me like, hey, I have 0, 1 for male, female, and I need to do like more complex transactions, more complex data transformations, you can always do that in DataWeave script. DataWeave is like a really powerful scripting language that you can use to transform your data. So I think there's something wrong with our application itself. So let's not run it. We can just go back to our API, or we can figure out how to deploy it. So next, what you can do is once the API is built and running, you would deploy it. So you'd have to run it somewhere. You need an area to run it. And essentially, what you can do with MuleSoft is you can go to the Anypoint Platform menu, just as we published this API on CloudHub. We can also publish it, or just as we published it on Exchange, we can deploy this to CloudHub. CloudHub is MuleSoft's managed infrastructure. So here, without having to worry about what server I deploy to or what kind of environment I deploy to, I can just give my API a name and then hit the deploy application button. And essentially, now this API is going to be available on the cloud for everybody to use. So going back to our use case, within like 5 or 10 minutes, we were able to build an API specification using the Visual API Designer. Once the specification was built, we were able to scaffold it into Studio, which made sure all the methods that we defined, all the data types that we defined are already there in Studio, and you're making sure you are implementing your API as you defined it. Because a lot of times what ends up happening is people say like, oh, my API is going to have these many resources, and then you don't have complete documentation. And I've been to numerous websites where I would try to call an API, and then I realize that this does not work the way it's expected. So it's always good to create the design first. And you just saw how doing this, Marty was able to execute his projects quickly. But that was just for Marty, and that was the producer side of things. Let's look at another use case for the consumer side of things. So this is Kelly, and she's a Salesforce admin with the sales operations team. She's not very technical. She doesn't have much experience with APIs and integrations, but she still has a use case where she needs to do a sync kind of a project where whenever a contact is created on Salesforce, it automatically gets created in the customer database that Marty had. And now that Marty has published this customer API onto Exchange, she doesn't have to actually add it to the database. She's just going to post it to the API itself. So she is, instead of using Studio, she's going to use Anypoint Flow Designer, which is the lightweight web-based IDE, again, for building these kinds of integrations. So let's see how she does that. So let's go back to our Anypoint platform and create a new Mule project. Let's call it Salesforce to API sync. And Flow Designer is meant for less technical users like admins so that it's a very guided process. So essentially, it will ask me for a trigger. In our case, our trigger is the Salesforce system. And we are going to have to create a new object, or whenever a new object is created, that's when we want this integration to get triggered. So we're going to say, whenever a new object is created on Salesforce, that's our trigger. Next is the target. So what's awesome about MuleSoft is the APIs that you publish on MuleSoft Exchange also become connectors. So the NTO orders API or the NTO customers API that we just built is now a connector. So I don't need to know how to call APIs to just use this API. If I click on the connector, I see the methods that I added, the get customer by ID, and the post customer now have become operations. So in our case, we are going to create a customer every time something is created on Salesforce. And just like that, I have a flow that shows me the Salesforce card, the transform card, and the API call that needs to be made. Again, there is an error because it's asking us to set up our credentials. So it's asking us for our Salesforce credentials. To save some time, I have done that here as well. Let me refresh before we go into that project itself. So in this, we have already added the credentials, and not only that, you can also test the connection, again, like we did for MySQL from Studio, you can test it for Salesforce as well. So looks like our connection was successful. The other thing here is you also get a drop-down. So all the objects, the standard objects that you see in Salesforce are shown here, as well as the custom objects. So the __C fields that you see in Salesforce are also shown here. So without even going to Salesforce, you know what to pick. And then you need to also transform the data. So you need to convert this data into the format that our API likes. We were just describing the format that our API is going to use. So when you see this on the left-hand side, it went inside Salesforce, and it found out what are the different fields that we have created on the contact object, including custom fields. So you have like so many fields out here. And this is very useful when you have like objects with a lot of fields. And on the right-hand side, you have what the API is looking for. Now, in Studio, we saw that we did the drag and drop, and we kind of transformed the data from one format to another. Flow Designer takes it to the next level, where it also offers a machine learning-based recommendation to do this mapping. So if I press preview, it automatically figures out the appropriate field. So like it mapped first name, last name automatically to the first name, last name here. And I can simply just apply this recommendation and get done with it. It also shows me a preview of the same thing. So right now it will be null because I have not added any sample data. But essentially it's going to show me a preview of what the new response is going to look like. So it's going to take everything on this side and make it look like the preview looks like right now. And then lastly, we also have our API that's all it's doing is using the mocking service. So it's not even using an actual implemented API. It's just using that mock service that we just created earlier. So while it loads, let's go ahead to Salesforce and create a contact. So let's create a new contact. Contact is of the type customer. And we are going to say Max, the mule, who is in our Ohana. Before I hit save, let me see if my flow is already running. Not this one, this one. And when the flow is running, it's actually running in a design environment. So essentially, it's spinning up a new worker, which is like a new VM, and it's setting up all the things before it starts to run. And this is just a design environment. So once this is running and we test it, we can also deploy it. And we can deploy it to either sandbox, production, based on what your requirements are. So you can also promote things from sandbox to production like you do typically with Salesforce. Let's give it a minute. If it does not run, we can come back to it later. OK, let's just come back to it later. I'm going to restart the application in the meanwhile, so that once we are back, we are going to make sure that it's running. Cool. So we just saw how what Marty had built earlier, the customer API. Somebody who is not very technical can take that API and then create all new applications on top of that API using tools like Flow Designer. So now Kelly was not only able to speed up their projects, but she was able to build on top of the projects that were created earlier, which makes future projects faster. So by creating that customer API, Marty did not only accelerate his time and his delivery, he also accelerated others in the team. Next, we are going to look at automated security. So MuleSoft has a unique layered approach to security. And we'll take that an example of an IT security director. So this is Jennifer, who is responsible for meeting NTO strict security guidelines from all the applications that they deploy within their application network. To start with, she starts with a secure foundation. So Anypoint Platform already comes with the baseline certifications like SOC 1, SOC 2, required to store PII information, PCI DSS. We have single sign-on. So she starts with a very strong foundation with a platform that's secure as it was built. And then on top of that, the platform allows you to build perimeters around your application network. So you can define software-defined perimeters that say, hey, these are the sales APIs, or these are the public APIs. So you can define perimeters that you want to secure in different ways. And once you define the perimeter, you can add policies to the perimeter. So this is a web access firewall policy that was added to the perimeter. And you can see that it's not writing a lot of code, and you don't have to be a security expert to set these up. You just select the configurations that you would like to enable from the OWASP top 10 attacks that the OWASP organization publishes. And you can also set up DDoS policies by adding rules. So we can say like, hey, if someone puts the wrong password X times, do this, otherwise do this, open this new window. So we can nest rules under each other and create these kinds of DOS policies as well. So that's how you add security onto layers. Now, going even a layer deeper, so you can also add API level policies. So on the API itself, you would add automated policies. For example, your IT requires every API to have authentication. You can add something like this, where you have the client ID enforcement added as an automated policy, which means that anytime an API is deployed, this policy is applied. So security is enabled by default for your organization. You have the secure foundation, you have perimeters defined, and you have these web access firewalls and the DDoS protections defined. But what about in action? So let's look at an orders API, which is already secured. So I'm going to go to API Manager. And first, let's look at automated policies. So the screen I was showing you earlier about client ID enforcement. So the client ID enforcement policy is already added. So any API I deploy here now, for instance, the orders API, and if I go to policies, the client ID enforcement is already added. So let's see what that looks like. So I'm into Postman. Postman is just like a client to make API calls. So I'm making an API call to this API. And as expected, it is asking for authentication because that automated policy was deployed. Now, let's give the right credentials and make another request. And it looks like we can see all the details within the API. But as you look at the API details, you can see that the customer email and the payment card information is being exposed in clear text format. And this might be a nightmare for IT directors because you are out of compliance and you can get into legal trouble because of this. What IT security administrator can do is they can go to the API itself, and there is a lot of out-of-the-box policies available that you can configure. So in our case, we are going to use the tokenization policy. And instead of adding a new one, I've already added one, and we just need to configure it. But essentially, we are tokenizing the value. So we're exchanging the original value with a token that looks exactly like the original value. So let's enable this policy. And let's go back to our request. So if we make the request again, we still get the clear text data. But that's because we are adding our access as the finance group. So finance group is the group that does analyzes purchase patterns and whatnot. So they need access to this data, and that's why they can see it. But if I do, or if I change my role to business analytics, we still see the data, but it's in a tokenized format. So their reporting, their applications will not break, but the data is still secure because you are not sending any of the data to them. So we're creating a format preserving token to make sure that there is no data leakage going on. And then if I were to, let's say, start doing a brute force attack where I just like continuously hit send, I will get blocked at some point because of the DDoS attack. Yeah, so I start getting 503 attacks because I set up the denial of service policy earlier. So going back to our slides, to recap what we just saw is we added the API level security using the automated policy. So we added the client ID enforcement. We added data security to it. So we added the tokenization policy to the API, which made sure that whenever sensitive information is there, we can tokenize it into the format that is compliant. And then we saw the feedback loop. And this is where we got the rate limiting access, where it said, hey, you cannot access this API anymore, because what was happening is the API was giving feedback to the perimeter saying somebody's trying to do a DDoS attack on this API, and then it feeds that information back to the perimeter that you defined earlier, and essentially it will block all access from all other APIs as well. So it's like a learning perimeter that learns from your APIs that you have deployed already on your application network. So that's automated security, with security which was enabled by default, and as well as added layers of security that we just configured right now. Next, let's look into how Anypoint Platform enables resilient operations. So this is Roxy. Roxy is an operations manager at NTO, and she is responsible for all the production APIs that they have. And she needs to make sure that all these APIs are always up and running. So she has access to Anypoint monitoring. Let's see what that looks like. So I'm going to go back to my Anypoint platform, and I'm going to change my business groups. So she's responsible for the products API. So these are out-of-the-box dashboards that she gets. So every morning with her first cup of tea, she opens up these dashboards, and she looks at different metrics like inbound request types, outbound request types, what are the connectors doing for this particular API. So if there is a database, is the database responsive enough, performance of her JVM and infrastructure. So these dashboards come out of the box, which give her a baseline of the monitoring that she needs for her applications. On top of that, she can also create custom dashboards. So she can create dashboards with metrics that were passed custom through the custom connector, which means that she can look at technical details as well as business details in the same view. Essentially, let's say there is an orders API and it's always placing orders. You can capture the amount of order and build reports like this, like showing how much revenue is this API generating. And by doing so, you are getting business buy-in as well as technical buy-in in terms of the assets that you own. So if you own an API that's serving products, it's easy to show that this API is very important to the business and the impact it has on the business overall. So we have metrics like revenue, review scores, and orders placed in the last 24 hours. You can also configure alerts. So I go to the products dashboard, you can go to the alerts tab, and you can configure alerts to alert you whenever something goes wrong. And lastly, you can also set up functional monitors. So a lot of times you would work with APIs that you don't have much control over. So you would want to periodically test if it's working. So for example, if I'm using a FedEx API and I want to make sure the FedEx API is up and running all the time, then I can use functional monitors to do that. And if something were to break, let's take a different approach where all the APIs are not working as expected, but something's breaking. So when something is failing, what would Roxy do? So first thing that would happen is she would get a Slack alert of what API is failing. Once she clicks on the Slack alert, she goes to this view called Visualizer, where she can see all the APIs that she's responsible for in one view. Let's wait for it to load. And I'm going to switch my view to the Connect 19 view. And I'm already filtered on failures. So I can see any failures that are happening in the past 30 days. And all my applications and the dependencies are clear from this. So if I click on the failure API, I can see there has been 13 failures in the last 30 minutes. So if I click on the dashboard, I go to the out-of-the-box dashboard for the same. And it looks like it just started failing here. You can zoom in, which also zooms in and pinpoints the exact location of the API. And lastly, you can go to logs, log search, filter on the API, and filter on the error. And just with 3 or 4 clicks, you are able to get to the root error and what exactly is causing the error. So Roxy can take a look at this error and then make sure that that gets fixed. So we just saw how Roxy was able to gain full visibility into her application network while making sure that her mean time to identification for issues and mean time to resolution is shortened down. By having access to tools like Visualizer and out-of-the-box dashboard, She doesn't have to build from scratch, and she starts with a secure and fully monitored foundation. Next, let's look at future-proof foundation. So this is Jack. He's a senior architect at NTO, and he's working on a project for moving to the cloud. So he has this orders API that was deployed on-prem, and now he needs to move it to Azure, the cloud preferred by NTO. So let's look at how he does that. So the first thing he does is goes to Runtime Manager, where he can see all his APIs and applications at one place. So he can see data center apps, Azure apps, and Cloud Hub apps all at one place. And since the orders API is deployed on-prem, he has access to the .jar file, which is how Mule applications are packaged. So to deploy this to cloud, all he needs to do is hit the deploy button, give it a name, select the target. So in our case, we are going to select Azure Runtime Fabric, and upload the jar file that we were just looking at. And now he can select his runtime version. So if he has different runtime versions, and then number of replicas. So if you want to run multiple replicas of the same API, allocate resources, memory, and hit the deploy button to deploy this application. No need to rewrite the application at all. So the same application that was running on-prem, he was able to deploy on the cloud without having to make any changes to the code. So with that, Jack was able to adapt to business changes quickly. So like you have 500 apps running on one on-prem or something, and IT comes and tells you, hey, move these all to Azure or AWS. You can do them with a few clicks without having to rewrite the whole application from the ground up. And then the second project where they're moving the other app, like the product API to cloud, they're using an API-led approach. So this is a whole overview of all the APIs at NTO. And they've divided into system, process, and experience APIs. So let's say they wanted to get rid of the product API in terms of what is on-prem, and they wanted to make sure that the customer orders API that is related to the product API does not get impacted. So what they can do is similar to how we took the orders API and we were able to upload it to Azure. They can remove this and replace it with the products API that runs on the cloud. And since the product API is a system API, it essentially makes sure that the connection to the customer orders data is not broken. And the advantage of this is there is no upstream impact. So if they were to spin up a new API for creating partner portals, they can just do it very easily without having to rewrite from the ground up. Not only that, they have another project coming up for a kiosk API. They can add that as well. And typically, people would integrate like kiosk to the customer, kiosk to the product, kiosk to the order. Instead, using this API-led approach, we are creating process APIs focused on business processes and making sure that we are creating experiences very quickly as we move on and adapt. Once all these APIs are built, they can be published on Exchange. So we are in this world of like everybody has APIs, everybody can go find each other's API and build on top of your business. So you can publish all these APIs on Exchange. So this is NTO's mobile Exchange portal. And now we have also launched API Community Manager, which is a joint product with Salesforce, so where you can do a more branded experience. So something like a Twilio or any API that you might love, you can create those kinds of experiences out of the APIs that you build. So the API that we saw in the first demo, where Marty was creating that customer API, now that can be published onto a public exchange like this. Developers can log in, they can get access, they can have engagement analytics of showing how many APIs are being used and how they're being used. And this way you move from just developing your own products to the community as a whole helping you build these products. And as we saw through the journey, how NTO was able to build their projects faster, they were able to build more secure projects, and they were also able to build projects that scale and they have full visibility into. So they have all these benefits from MuleSoft and making sure that they are starting on a future-proof foundation. So essentially, when things change, when there are new technologies out there, they are able to adapt to these changes. And don't just take our word for it. Take the word of our 1,600 plus customers out there. They are all using MuleSoft, and they have been successfully being able to create their own application network, like how we just saw with NTO. And lastly, if you want to learn more about MuleSoft, there is all these resources available to you. So developers.mulesoft.com, it has some quick start guides. There is a user community to help you out. There is free online training, which is self-paced. It's called MuleSoft U. So if you can go to training.mulesoft.com. And lastly, we have this fresh trail that just launched today, which is called SFDC, or Automate Order to Cash. And essentially, you will be building an order to cash flow on this trail by yourself using Flow Designer. And I'm right out of time, so thank you, and I will field questions, and I might be standing in the side if they kick me out.